Hi guys! Thank you all for tuning in and welcome back to Sewing Lara. In this video I will show you how to stitch on different types of buttons. You will see how to stitch on flat buttons in several different ways, how to stitch on shank buttons, a snap, and I will also show you how to work with two different types of toggle buttons and how to create this pretty closure. Let's start with stitching on flat buttons. So I already stitched one on so that you see what we're gonna do, and I made here a mark. That's where I want to have the second button stitched on. So let me grab a little bit bigger one. I threaded my needle. The needle is centered and at the end is a knot. Now I want to chop off the extra thread so that the knot will be as small as possible. And I will pinch the needle through a very small place in the center of my mark. That's also going to be the center of the button. I personally like going through a second time. And now I will place the button on the top of the mark where my thread is coming out, and this is supposed to be also the center of the button, so I have to align the center of the button with this. So I will place it on the top and I will hold my button in place. Now I will pull the needle first through the top hole from my point of view and then through the bottom hole, and then I will come with the thread on the other side, and on the other side I will pinch the needle through so that I will come through the top hole again. And I'll do it 2 more times. And now, instead of returning through the top hole, I will pinch the needle through the second bottom hole. And that way I will stitch the button on just like this one has been stitched on, meaning the thread creates 2 rows with these 4 holes in the flat button. Now when I made my last stitch, I will simply return beneath the button instead of going through a hole. I will stitch through a very small place once and twice, and then before I pull the thread through, I'll grab here the thread and I will wrap it twice around the needle, pull it tightly, and then I go through with the thread, pull on the end so that it's tight, and that way I made the sew up. And now I can chop off the thread and the button has been stitched on. So that's the basic way how to do it. And the way I stitch the button on makes the button lay very flat on the fabric. And that is meant only for buttons and for fabrics that are quite thin, that I can easily pull over the button when I have the second side with the buttonhole. If I had a really thick fabric, like actually the denim fabric is, you can see when I create a button placket how much thicker it is. And if I had a buttonhole here and would pull it over the button when I would close it, there would not be enough space beneath the button for such thick layer of fabric. And that's why I want to stitch the button on in a way that it would be elevated. And for that I will need a match, so I'm gonna make another mark. Now I will place the match like so, and we'll place the button on the match. Now the match made the button a little bit elevated, so I simply pull the thread through the buttonhole on the bottom. It tangled a little bit, so I'm gonna pull it out again, place the match again so that it's centered, make sure the button is on the right spot. And now I will stitch the button on basically just the same way like we did the first one, with the exception that between the button and between the fabric is now the match. I'm also not gonna be pulling too tight on the thread because I want it to be a little loose, so I think twice will do because the thread is really thick. Now I just come here through below the second hole and stitch on the other side in the very same way. Now I will return beneath the button, pull the thread through the right side, and I will remove the match. Now you can see that this is quite loose, and I will wrap the thread a couple of times around the thread on the bottom, and that way it creates kind of a shank. And then I'll pull the thread through once and twice through the thread that's been wrapped around, and I will do the sew up. And now you will notice that the button is slightly elevated, so I would be able to close it with a thicker layer of fabric. Instead of stitching the button on so that you would have here these 2 rows of thread, you can grab a button with 4 holes and you can cross the thread, basically going from the top hole on the right through the bottom hole on the left and vice versa. So I'll demonstrate. I will place my button in place, then I'll go through the top right hole, and instead of going through the bottom right hole, I'll go through the bottom hole on the left side, and then I will return through the very same top hole on the right side, go again through the left bottom, and since the thread is really thick, I will go up through the top left hole, go through the right bottom, do it one more time. Then I'll return from the wrong side below the button, and I'll do the sew up. And now you see the thread creates here a cross instead of 2 rows. So which way you choose, that's of course up to you, whatever you find prettier. A third option would be to create such little rectangle in the middle of your button through the holes. So for that, I'm gonna grab a little bit smaller button again. So you would start wherever your button should be placed. Then you would position your button, you would go through, let's say, top right, bottom right, then bottom left, go through top left, return to top right, and this time instead of going to the bottom, you would go to top on the left side. Then you would come through bottom on the left and then through bottom on the right. And you would repeat it a couple of times so that you have as many layers as you want to, and that way you would create this rectangle. It can be also very pretty, especially when you're using a different color than the buttons are, because then it would stand out and it could create an additional embellishment for your piece. Now this was how you would stitch on buttons when you have just one layer of fabric, but most of the time you will have some kind of a button placket, which is this folded side. And here you will not go all the way through the fabric, because what you want is that the wrong side would remain nice and clean. So I'm just gonna turn it this way because it's a little bit easier for me to stitch it on. So I will start here. Let's say this is the place where we want to have our button. And I'll go twice through. Now we'll grab our button and I will go through the top hole again first, while holding the button aligned with the center over the place where the button is supposed to be positioned. Now I'm going to pull the thread through just the hole. I'm not gonna go through the fabric yet. I will make sure that the button is positioned correctly, and now I will pull the thread through the top layer of the fabric only. I will make sure that I do not penetrate the other side. See? Nothing on this side. And I came through the right side again, so I'll go again through the top right hole, then pull the thread again just through the hole on the bottom right. And then you can always kind of like fold the fabric a little bit and make sure where you're coming through, and only again through the top layer of the fabric. So now I'll go again through the top, through the bottom, and I want to move to the left bottom hole, so I'm just gonna go through here through a little spot and pinch the needle through the bottom hole. You can always turn your work around if it's easier for you. I personally do it a lot. And then now this time the hole that used to be a top is a bottom. So I'll do it basically the same way how I did it with the other side and stitch the other side on, always making sure that the thread won't come through here. And when I come through with the needle for the last time, I simply stitch through a very small place once or twice, and then I will do the sew up and my button will be stitched on. Let's do it again, but this time with the match. So let's place the button here in the middle. So I threaded my needle, made a knot. Let's go through just like we did at the beginning. Chop off as much as we can from the knot so that there's nothing sticking out. And we will position first our match. What you can do is you can make one stitch around the match, because that way it will stay in place. Don't make it too tight because you want to be able to pull the match later through, but that's a really great help. And now you can place the button on the match. So I'll come through this hole on the top, just like with the button that we did before, first through the hole on the bottom. I'll kind of fold the fabric just to be sure where I'm going through. Pull only through the top layer, and then I'll go through the top hole again, through the bottom, and one more time. What you can do is, once you pull the needle through, before you pull also the thread through, you can return your piece and see, just to make sure that the needle is not visible on the other side. Basically ensure yourself that you're pulling only through the top layer of the fabric. So I'll go here through to the left side, a little piece next to the place where I just came through. I'll go through the top hole, through the bottom, fold the fabric here like so, and return to the top hole, go through again, through the button, fold the fabric again just to see where I'm going. It's always good to help yourself with these little tricks, folding the fabric, turning your work around. It makes life much easier. And now I came through for the last time, so I'm gonna remove the match. And since I didn't stitch it on too tightly, it was very easy. Now I will fold the fabric like so, that's what I like doing. And I'll wrap the thread a couple of times around the button to create a shank. And now I will simply pinch through here and one more time, and then I will do the sew up, and we stitched a second button on a button placket, but this time in an elevated way so that it would be basically like a shank button. Now we are going to stitch on this shank button. So I already threaded my needle. I will do the sew up here. Now I will grab the shank button. You will notice that it has this fleur-de-lis motif on the top, and when I turn it over you will notice that the loop is vertical. So that means if I want the motif to face this way, I have to stitch the button on from left to right. So I'm going to be pulling the needle through the loop horizontally. So that's what I'm going to do. I will simply pull the needle through, and then I will go through the fabric again from right to the left, because I went first from the left through the loop of the button. And now I will go through the loop below the button, if I don't miss it. And then again through the fabric, and I'll repeat that a couple of times. And now that I can tell that the button is stitched on securely, I can do the sew up here below the button, or I could simply pinch the needle through to the wrong side and do the sew up on the wrong side. But I'm gonna do it below the button, so I'm just gonna go through a small spot and stitch through the fabric, and then I'm gonna stitch through again, and I'm gonna do 2 knots, pull the thread through, chop the thread off, and the shank button has been successfully stitched on. Now I have here these 2 sides of a press button, and I already made 2 marks on the denim. That's where I want to stitch them on. So let's start with this side. So you will notice that around the edges are small holes. I have already threaded my needle and I made a knot at the end. I'm gonna pinch the needle through the center of the mark, and then I'm gonna pull the needle through one of the holes, and I'm gonna place the button, the side of the press button, over the mark. I'm gonna make sure that it's centered, and I'm gonna hold it with my thumb. And now I'm gonna hold it like so. I'm gonna stitch here through the fabric and go back through the hole, and I'm gonna do it one more time, and that's secure enough. Then I'm gonna pinch the needle through the fabric and back, but instead of returning through this hole, I'm just gonna come through like so, and then I will pull the needle through the next hole. So I will turn my work around a little bit, and I'll do the same here. So I'll stitch once and twice through, and for the 3rd time I simply pinch the needle through the fabric, turn my work around, and go through the next hole. And that's the whole principle. And when you're done, it's time for sew up. So you can make the sew up here very closely, a little bit beneath the edge. That's one possibility. The other possibility would be, of course, to simply go through to the wrong side and do the sew up on the opposite side of the fabric, but I prefer this. We're gonna stitch on the other side a little bit differently, but it's still gonna be very similar. So I'm gonna go through the center, just like I did with the first side of the press button. So I have a knot at the end of the thread. I will place this side of the press button centered, just like I did with the other one. I'll go through one of the holes, but instead of stitching then here through the fabric closer to the edge, I'm gonna stitch through the other hole. And then from the wrong side, I'm gonna return to the right side of the fabric a little bit more to my left, and I will come through this hole. And I'll do the same here, or actually the same that I did with the first stitch. So I'm basically making a running stitch around the edge of this press button side. So now I have 3 stitches. I will go through here where I actually started, but instead of going in the same direction, I'm gonna turn to the other direction. So I'll stitch here through the hole, which means I will come through at the end of this stitch. Then I'll turn my work around. I'll pinch through this hole. I will return from the wrong side through this hole and here. And now I have stitch around the entire edge. And here's what it looks like. So now I could use the press button if I wanted to. And this time I'll do the sew up on the wrong side. So that's all for these buttons, and now I'm gonna show you how to make this cute closure for toggle buttons. And I'm gonna use a toggle button that has holes smaller than the cord that I'm gonna use for the closure. So first let's go over what this closure actually looks like so that you understand what we are gonna be doing. So you have two sides, and both sides are made of 4 loops, and the loops should be about the same size. So you will need 2 pieces of a cord of your choice, and then you'll need a toggle button. So you can see that this toggle button has been simply stitched on one of the sides because the holes were too small. If you were using a toggle button that would have big enough holes, then you would do it this way. So you would first pull the cord through the toggle button, and then you would create your first loop, and then you would continue creating the other loops like so. You always have to turn your work a little bit and play with it, and then you would pin this in place and simply stitch the loops together, and the side with the button would be then done. And the second side is just a form made of 4 loops. So since our toggle button has very tiny holes and the cord wouldn't fit through, all we have to do is to make 2 of these shapes that consist of 4 loops. So the way I like doing it is I like grabbing the cord and folding it in the middle, and then I always like placing a pin here because then I know where the middle is. And then I create my first 2 loops, and I will tuck on the cord and pull until I will be sure that they are the same size. And then I will grab a pin and pin the end here in place, and I will start stitching these 2 together with a whip stitch. But it's not just a whip stitch that I'm using. Sometimes I go through with a running stitch because I want these to be really securely stitched together. And I usually go here around the edges with the whip stitch. You can also do blanket stitch. It's just important that nothing frays out and that the loops are securely stitched together. And then once I secured these 2 first loops, I can go ahead and create the last 2 loops, and I always make sure that I tuck the tail, the end of the second loop, below the cord so that it can't be seen. Let's do this again. So I have here again this piece of cord. I will fold it in the middle, and then I'll position my pin, which is my mark, and I will create the first 2 loops, and I will make sure that I will tuck the tail in. So one way of how to do it is also you will simply kind of loop around your pin like so. Then you will place the end over the center. You can also stitch the tail in first. That's sometimes actually a good idea. So I will simply stitch with a whip stitch. And I can already remove the pin. And now I will place the cord over it like so. I will make sure that both loops are the same size. I find this actually even easier when I stitch in the end first. And here I'll go through with a running stitch. And then I can do the same with the other side. So I will basically make a loop like so, and I will position the end here and stitch it in place first. So first a running stitch and then a few whip stitches. And then I'll place the rope, the cord over it, and it makes a really nice result. I specifically did not explain the running stitch and the whip stitch because I already have for that tutorials on this channel, so I will link all videos here in the right corner and also in the video description. So now I'm gonna finish this loop and then we will stitch on the button. Alright, so both sides of the closure are basically done and all that's missing is the toggle button. So I'm gonna grab this toggle button and I will place it on one of the loops. I find it really helpful to grabbing the loop and adjusting it like so and marking the center so that I will know that I will position my button correctly, and I will place it so that the center between the two holes will be positioned over the pin. But first I will go through with the thread a couple of times. I made a knot at the end, not at the end, on the end. And then I will simply go through the first hole. I will return with the needle through the hole, and then I will pinch the thread through the cord. And since this is a black cord and black thread, I won't really bother hiding the thread much, so I will simply return like that. So I'm doing a simple running stitch and I'm stitching the toggle button on this end of the closure, and that way you can use toggle buttons even with much smaller holes for any cord, for no matter how wide it is. So I'm gonna do then the sew up at the end, but I guess at this point you have a really great idea how to make this cute closure. And this is a wonderful closure for example, duffel coats, or you can use it for any traditional clothing. And that's gonna be it for our today's tutorial. Now you know how to stitch on various buttons in different ways and how to make this beautiful closure. If you are a sewing beginner, I will link down below a few playlists that might be interesting for you. Thank you all so much for watching and happy sewing!